Hey guys, it's Lucky Ghost here, and today we're going to be going over weapons, specifically which weapons are good at what, which one you should use, and how to know the difference. Some weapon lines are not great at doing damage, some are. Not only that, some of the weapon lines have multiple different types of weapons inside of them, like maces, mauls, daggers, axes. What does that mean? What are the differences between these? And when should you use each one? Why do Inferno Stabs typically parse the highest? Why are Ice Stabs so popular now? Let's dive into each one of these questions and get an answer for you, so that you can understand the different types of weapons in Elder Scrolls Online and hopefully make an informed decision when it comes time to choose one. Alright, first up, let's talk about the two-handed weapon line. The two-handed weapon line consists of three different weapons. We've got mauls, greatswords, and battle axes. There is a difference between these that is more than just cosmetic, and we'll get into that in a second. But first, before we jump into the passives, let's talk about the skills and what this line is good for. The two-handed weapon line is great for both PvE and PvP. It's got weighty, impactful hits, so let's take a look at the abilities. The first ability in the line has one morph, which is Wrecking Blow, or the other morph, which is Dizzying Swing. Either way, it's a wind-up that smacks the enemy, dealing a ton of damage. One of these morphs can knock the enemy off balance, allowing you to topple them over, while the other focuses on damage. This is one of the spammables of this skill line, and it feels really good to use. The next ability is Critical Charge. This is a gap closer that allows you to close distance on an enemy and get within melee range so that you can start unloading damage on them with these abilities. The next ability is Cleave, which has a couple of morphs, one of which is Brawler, which is going to put a shield around your character for every enemy that you hit. It's a great AoE ability damage that makes your character incredibly tanky while still continuing to dish out a ton of damage to everything around you. The other morph of this ability puts a bleed dot on the enemies. The next ability is Reverse Slash, which has a couple of morphs, Reverse Slice and Executioner. Reverse Slice is an AoE execute ability, meaning when you use it on one ability, it's going to do 78% of the damage you do to that enemy to all enemies nearby. It's fantastic for unloading massive damage on tons of enemies nearby once things start getting low in health. The other morph is a single target variant, which does more damage but only to one target. And the final ability is Momentum, which is a self buff. It's going to give you Major Brutality, increasing your weapon damage by 20%, and you gain Minor Endurance, increasing your stamina recovery by 15%. This ability sees more use in PvP than in PvE, because in PvE, we can just use a potion to get Major Brutality, so we don't need to use this ability to get it. And as for the two-handed ultimate, Berserker Strike, it's going to swing your weapon over your head, dealing a tremendous amount of direct damage to the enemy. Now let's dive into the meat of the weapon line. Right, these are the abilities, but what determines which weapon line you use is just as much determined by the passives. So the first passive is Forceful. Your light and heavy attacks damage up to 3 nearby enemies for 50% of the damage inflicted to the primary target. Well, light attacks are one of our largest sources of damage in Elder Scrolls Online because we're doing a light attack in between every ability. So the sheer number of them that we do means that these always end up as one of our top damage dealers at the end of a parse or when we're done killing something. One of the primary types of damage that we dish out is always our light attacks when we're maximizing our damage. And this passive makes that light attack an AoE ability, so our primary target plus 3 additional targets are all taking damage every time we light attack, allowing two-handed weapon users to be incredibly capable AoE damage dealers. The next passive, Heavy Weapons, grants two-handed weapons with the following bonuses. So as I mentioned earlier, the different types of two-handed weapons isn't purely cosmetic. There are differences between the greatswords, the battle axes, and the mauls. The greatswords are going to increase your weapon and spell damage by 284, which is going to increase the damage of your attacks and your abilities. Battle axes are going to increase your critical damage by 12%, which means when you crit, that critical damage is going to be increased by another 12%. Maces or mauls are going to increase your armor penetration by 3,300. Armor penetration is a pretty complicated topic, but all you need to know is enemies have a certain amount of resistances, and in order to do 100% of your damage, you must fully penetrate those resistances. So if they have 5,000 resistances, you must have 5,000 penetration in order to penetrate their resistances and do 100% of your damage. If they have 10,000 resistances and you only have 9,000 penetration, you're losing out on a bit of damage for every ability and attack that you do to that enemy. The more that you are underpenning, the more damage that you're losing when you're attacking that enemy. So it's very important to make sure you are penetrating your enemy's resistances in both PvE and PvP content. So as you can see, all 3 weapon types are increasing your damage in different ways. If your penetration is good, then you don't need to worry about a mace and you can choose between the sword or the axe. If you know your enemy's resistances are going to be incredibly high and you don't have enough penetration, then you should go for them all. Different weapons are going to be better in different situations. However, all three are going to be great in all situations. So don't stress it too much. And for what it's worth, I'm mostly using the maul this patch on my two-handed character, as I found that group compositions is causing me to underpen and the maul is offsetting that. Next, let's talk about the one hand and shield. In Elder Scrolls Online, one hand and shield is very much dedicated towards tanks. Both the abilities and the passives are set up to aid tanks in doing their job. The first ability here is Puncture, which is going to taunt the enemy. The next is Low Slash, which is going to reduce the enemy's damage. And then you have Defensive Posture, which is going to be another form of damage mitigation. And Shield Charge, which is a gap closer, and Power Bash, which is going to do a little bit of damage. As for the Sword and Board Ultimate, Shield Wall. It's going to reinforce your shield, allowing you to automatically block all attacks at no cost for 5 seconds. What this means is when you use this ability, you'll be able to block incoming heavies, stuns, and anything that would otherwise immobilize your character, which is very useful when you run out of resources and are unable to block yourself, or if you have an ally on the ground that you need to res, but the boss is attacking you and preventing you from doing so, you pop this ultimate and you're safe to res for 5 seconds. When we look at the passives, you have Fortress, which reduces the stamina costs of your one hand and shield abilities by 15% and reduces the cost of blocking by 36%. That 36% cost reduction is pretty huge for tanks, as the hardest part about being a tank is not running out of resources. So costing 36% less of your resources to block is huge, as that's one of the primary consumers of those resources. The next passive is Sword and Board. With one hand, weapon, and shield equipped, increase your weapon damage by 5% and the amount of damage you can block by 20%. So now when you block, that block is absorbing 20% more of the damage. That's huge for tanks. So both of these passives you do not get if you are running a two-handed weapon or dual wield, right? So for those reasons alone, it's way better to use Sword and Board on a tank than either of those skill lines. The next passive, Deadly Bash, with the one-hand weapon and shield equipped, improves your standard bash attacks, causing them to deal 1500 more damage and cause 40% less stamina. So that stamina reduction is huge. Tanks are the closest one to the boss, so oftentimes they're responsible for interrupting the boss when it starts to do a channeled ability or it starts to cast an ability that can be interrupted. And as I mentioned earlier, the most important thing for a tank is not to run out of resources. So that 40% reduced cost to interrupt enemy attacks is huge. The 1500 additional damage dealt for bashing is fairly trivial, especially in PvE content. Deflect Bolts. With one hand, weapon, and shield equipped, increase the amount of damage you can block from projectiles and range attacks by 14%. Again, another form of damage mitigation. So everything we've had here has been damage mitigation and cost reduction while blocking or bashing. Very, very tank oriented, and basically nothing here for dealing damage. Next, we have, with a one-hand weapon and shield equipped, reduce movement speed penalty of bracing. So when you're blocking, you move slower, and when you invest in this passive, it causes you to move less slow than you previously would have. Again, this is all about what's happening to your character while it's blocking. Very, very tank oriented. Typically, we see two types of builds in this game using a sword and shield. One, a PvE tank, or two, a PvP build. PvP builds will typically put a sword and board on the back bar as a place to go when they need some extra protection. Perhaps there's one or two people attacking them and they need to turtle to mitigate the damage, get their life back up to full so that they can return to going to the offensive. But as of right now in PvE, the sword and board is not a great way to do damage. Okay, the next skill line is dual wields. The dual wield skill line is great for doing damage. It's not great for tanking. Both stamina and magic at DPS can use the dual wield skill line as of the most recent patch. We'll get into why in a second. The abilities include Flurry, which is basically a flurry of attacks. It's a channeled ability that does some damage. Twin Slashes, which is a nice dot. Whirling Blades, which is a 360-degree AoE ability that deals a ton of damage to enemies that are low health. Blade Cloak, which is a nice damage mitigation ability, and then Hidden Blade, which is a nice damage ability that also buffs your character. The dual wield ultimate is Lacerate. You slash your enemy in front of you, causing them to bleed for 32,000 damage over 8 seconds and healing yourself for 50% of the damage done. Basically, this is throwing an incredible bleed on the enemy and healing you at the same time. But let's take a look at the passives. Slaughter increases damage done with dual wield abilities by 20% to enemies under 25% health. So where the two-handed weapon would get AoE damage with every light attack, Slaughter is now going to increase our damage to enemies under 20% health for all of our abilities, which means that dual wield characters are really going to shine and execute. The next passive is Dual Wield Expert, which increases weapon and spell damage by 6% of our offhand weapon damage. The next passive is Controlled Fury, while dual wielding reduces the stamina cost of dual wield abilities. The next one, Ruffian, while using dual wield attacks, gives you 15% damage bonus when the enemy is stunned, immobilized, or disoriented, or silenced. And finally, Twin Blade and Blunt. While dual wielding, you get different bonuses based on the type of weapon you're using. Here again, we have different cases where different weapons will be better than others. Each axe is going to increase our critical damage done by 4%. Each mace is going to increase our penetration by 1650. Each sword increases our weapon and spell damage by 142. And each dagger increases our critical chance by 812. The current meta is to use 2 daggers. The meta choice between these options is always changing based on the way ZOS manipulates bonuses for different sets in the game. In a recent patch, they nerfed critical chance on a lot of sets, so everybody has been going dual wield dagger to increase their critical chance to get it back up to where it was. So depending on which changes ZOS makes, and when you watch this video, that may or may not still be the meta choice. So just bear in mind that that is something that is subject to change. And just like the two-handed weapon, if you heavy attack with dual wield, you'll get stamina back. As of the last patch, magic attunes can now use dual wield weapons and take advantage of things like the critical chance from dual wield daggers. The upside is the increased critical chance that they'll obtain from using the dual wield daggers. The downside is they're now a melee tune because they have to light attack between abilities. If they're not near the enemy, they can't touch them with their light attacks, which means they're not going to be proccing ult regen. They're not going to be proccing weapon enchants. And if they heavy attack with that weapon, they're going to bring stamina back in when oftentimes what they're going to need is magicka. So if you decide to use dual wield on a magic attune, just realize you are forgoing the ability to be as effective at range, and essentially turning that magic attune into a melee character. In some content, this is not a problem at all, and in others it is. Sometimes you'll see endgame players have a set of daggers on them for their magic attune, and for the times when they need to be able to be ranged, they'll have a staff on hand. And it's worth noting that two-handed weapons are going to contribute 2 pieces of a 5-piece bonus. Basically, for each hand that is used by a weapon, it is going to contribute that many pieces of a set. So your two-handed weapon will contribute 2 pieces. Your one hand and shield, each piece, the one hand will contribute 1 piece and the shield would contribute 1 piece. The dual wield, each weapon will contribute 1 piece for a total of 2. The bow is a two-handed weapon, it contributes 2 pieces. The destruction staff is a two-handed weapon, it's going to contribute 2 pieces, and the resto as well will contribute 2 pieces of that 5-piece bonus. It's important to clarify that because a lot of people think, hey, the two-handed sword is 1 item, so it's going to be 1 piece of the 5-piece bonus. Nope, it doesn't work that way. It used to at one time, but that gave two-handed weapons a significant disadvantage when putting together sets, so they went ahead and balanced it. Now, two-handed weapons are 2 parts of a 5-piece set. All right, next up, let's talk about bows. Bows are good for both PvP and PvE damage dealing characters. Bows have abilities like Snipe, which is a single target ranged attack that does high damage, or the next ability, which is an AoE where you rain down arrows on the enemy. And the next ability is Scattershot, which you can use to knock enemies down. Arrow Spray, which is a direct damage AoE ability that just fires a line of arrows out in front of you, causing damage to everything in front of you 1 time. And finally, Poison Arrow, which is a single target dot and can be morphed into an execute ability, Poison Injection. As you would expect, all of these abilities are ranged abilities that you fire off of your bow, and they all cost stamina. And when you heavy attack with a bow, it brings stamina back in, making bows ideal for stamina DPS tunes. And as for the bow ultimate, we have Rapid Fire, which unleashes a barrage of arrows at the enemy, dealing tons of damage over 4 seconds. You can move at full speed and are immune to all disabling effects while channeling this ability. You can either wear the bow on the front bar or the back bar or both. It's up to you. So let's look at the passives and how they work. It gives you a damage boost of up to 12% against enemies at longer range. So what this means is when you're able to, if you're a little bit away from the enemy, you can do up to 12% more damage. Oftentimes the benefits of this passive are far outweighed by the benefits of being with your group during a fight. You'll oftentimes see new players thinking, hey, because of this passive, I need to stand far away from the enemy to do damage. But what that means is you're not standing in the heals or the buffs. If this doesn't make sense to you, be sure to check out my damage dealer formation video, linked in the description below. But just know that typically when you're in a group, you're not trying to be far away from the enemy, you're trying to be in front of your healer and behind the enemy. Accuracy. With a bow equipped, increase your critical chance by 13-14. Okay, that's nice. You get a little more crit chance. Ranger with a bow equipped reduces the stamina cost of a bow ability by 15%. Just a little bit of cost reduction. It's a way to make your character more proficient with the bow, but it's not really changing the way you play when you have the bow. Hawkeye, with a bow equipped, dealing damage with a light or heavy attack increases the damage of your bow abilities by 5% for 5 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. And then finally, Hasty Retreat grants Major Expedition for 4 seconds after you use the dodge roll. Major Expedition increases your movement speed by 30%. This passive lends itself to the mobility of a bow user. Simply dodge rolling increases your movement speed by 30% for 4 seconds. That's very nice. All right, next up we have the Destruction Staff. The Destruction Staff lends itself to Magicka users. As you would expect, there's 3 different types of Destruction Staffs. There's Ice, Fire, and Lightning, and we'll get into those in a second. First, let's talk about the abilities. You have a spammable in the first ability, which deals damage to a target that you select. The next ability is an AoE Wall of Elements. It's basically a rectangle of damage that you emit in front of you, and the type of elemental damage that it does is determined by the staff that you're using. If you're using a fire staff, it will put fire on the ground. If you're using a lightning staff, it'll put lightning on the ground. And similarly, if you're using a frost staff, it will put frost on the ground or ice. And this is where we start to establish a difference between the different types of builds that are going to use the different types of weapons here. The fire staff is going to be for more of a single target damage setup. So for instance, fire staffs typically parse the highest on boss fights. The Frost Staff is really going to lend itself to tanks because, as you can see here, Unstable Wall of Frost costs more but grants a damage shield and immobilizes chilled enemies. It's going to be a bit of a damage mitigation ability as well, which is great for tanks. And we'll dive into some passives below that also lend themselves to tanks. The Unstable Wall of Storms is going to set concuss enemies off balance, which means when they're off balance, if you heavy attack them, you're going to get more resources back. Next, we have Destructive Touch, which does a bit of damage and then follows up with a dot. Then we have Elemental Drain, which is insanely useful for magic attunes. This is going to lower the enemy's resistances with Major Breach, and it's also going to apply Minor Magicka Steal, which is going to cause you to get Magicka back every second as long as you're attacking the enemy. This ability is incredibly useful for your sustain as a magic attune. In a group, the healer is typically going to run this ability, but when you're by yourself as a magic attune, it's still worth slotting this ability on your bar if you're having sustain issues. If you're running out of Magicka, this is going to greatly help. Cast this on the enemy at the beginning of the fight to make sure that you constantly have Magicka coming back in. Not only that, but look, it costs 0 resources to cast this ability. As for the Destruction Staff Ultimate, we have Elemental Rage. Basically, what this is going to do is after 2 seconds, it's going to build up and then lay waste to everything in the area, dealing a ton of damage per second for 7 seconds. If you're holding an Inferno Staff, it's going to be Fiery Rage, which increases the damage by 15%. If you have an Ice Staff, it's going to immobilize the enemy's hit for 3 seconds. And if you have a Lightning Staff, it's going to cause Thunderous Rage, increasing the duration by 2 seconds. But let's take a look at the passives to understand why and when we use the staffs and which staff is good for which builds. First off, Tri-Focus. Fully charged Inferno heavy attacks deal 12% additional damage. Lightning Staff heavy attacks deal damage to nearby enemies for 100% of the damage done. Fully charged Ice Staff heavy attacks grant you a damage shield that absorbs almost 5,000 damage. While an Ice Staff is equipped, blocking costs Magicka instead of stamina. The Inferno Staff heavy attack buff is not that big of a deal, but the Lightning Staff buff of 100% of the damage done to the target also applying to the nearby enemies is huge for lightning heavy attack builds. And the Ice Staff applying a shield that absorbs 5,000 damage on heavy attacks is pretty huge as well. Typically, tanks run staves like this on the back bar and they come back and heavy attack to get resources back from time to time. Getting a shield on top of that heavy attack that you were already going to do anyways can be nice. Sometimes tanks elect not to take this passive because the last line there says, while an Ice Staff is equipped, blocking costs Magicka instead of stamina. So tanks have an option here. They can either choose to have their blocking always cost stamina and pass on this passive, or they can use Magicka as a backup resource pool. So if they run out of stamina, they can switch to the back bar and they can still block with their staff, and it's going to cost Magicka, so they're going to absorb that hit rather than be chunked down by it or possibly killed. It really depends on the tank and how they set their build up, whether or not they choose to take this passive. The next passive is Penetrating Magic. With Destruction Staff equipped, your Destruction Staff abilities ignore 10% of the enemy's spell resistance. The next passive is Elemental Force. When Destruction Staff is equipped, increase your chance to apply elemental status effects by 100%. And Ancient Knowledge. This is where we get into another difference between the Flame, the Ice, and the Lightning Staffs. With Destruction Staff equipped, equipping an Inferno Staff increases your damage done with single target abilities by 8%. This means that your spammable, which is usually a single target ability or considered to be one, is going to do 8% more damage. This is the ability you use more than any other, so that's a significant buff. This is also going to buff single target dots. This is also going to buff every single light attack that you're doing between every single ability, which, when you combine all of these things, is the reason that Inferno Staffs typically outparse any other type of staff. The next line says, equipping a Lightning Staff increases your damage done with area of effect abilities by 8%. So if you're using an AoE spammable, like possibly jabs, or lots of AoE abilities, or possibly a heavy attack build, so you're taking advantage of the Tri-Focus passive for lightning doing damage to all enemies nearby, you can see lightning staffs become pretty useful for those types of builds. And finally, we have the Ice Staff line, which says that Ice Staffs reduce the cost of blocking by 36% and increases the amount of damage you block by 20%. You may remember those numbers from earlier. These are exactly the same numbers that the Sword and Shield got in the One Hand and Shield line. So here it says 36% cost reduction of blocking, and here it says reduce the amount of damage when you block by an additional 20%. 36, 20, Destruction Staff, Frost Staff, 36 and 20% again. So basically what ZOS has done is they've made the Frost Staff an alternative tank item set so that they don't have to run Sword and Board on both front and back bars. They have a nice second option in the Ice Staff, which also comes with a great deal of utility. They can use things like Unstable Wall of Elements to proc enchants, to apply buffs, and to apply shields to the group. They can cast Elemental Drain if they need to, and they can heavy attack to get resources back, specifically Magicka, because on the front bar they have the Sword and Board, and if they heavy attack with the Sword and Board, they'll get stamina back. But what if they need Magicka in order to heal themselves? Well, then they'd have to heavy attack with their staff on the back bar instead. And then finally we have Destruction Expert. When you absorb damage using a Destruction Staff damage shield, you restore 1800 Magicka. This effect can occur once every 10 seconds. So this passive pairs really nicely with what we were talking about earlier, where if you heavy attack, you get the shield, and if you apply a Wall of Elements, you also put a shield around yourself. Both of these things are going to be helping to restore Magicka for your character if you're a tank or if you're a mage that happens to be using a Frost Staff. So to recap, who should use which type of weapon? Well, typically we're seeing the highest parses come from Inferno Staffs. That is until the Magdin became somewhat of a ice specialist. So the Magdin could be the exception to that rule, where they are doing a ton of damage with double ice staves due to some class passives that increase the damage they do with ice abilities and to frozen targets. We're seeing tanks run Frost Staves, and we're seeing healers run either Frost Staves or Lightning Staves, depending on what the group needs. All right, next up, let's talk about Restoration Staves. Restoration Staves are another two-handed weapon that healers use. These are built specifically for healers, just like One Hand and Shield is built specifically for tanks. There's no damage really coming out of this line. It's specifically built for healing and for improving your ability to heal. We've got Grand Healing, which is a nice AoE heal that you place on the ground. We've got Regeneration, which basically casts a heal over time onto allies nearby. We've got Blessing of Protection, which heals and buffs your group. We've got Steadfast Ward, which puts a shield around the lowest HP ally nearby. We've got Force Siphon, which focuses your staff power to apply minor life steal to an enemy for 18 seconds, healing you and your allies for 600 health every second when damaging them. And as for the Restoration Staff Ultimate, we have Panacea, which will release the rejuvenating energies of your staff to whirl around you, healing you or an ally every second for 5 seconds. As you would expect, this can be a fantastic way to keep the party members alive when you have a ton of damage coming in. And then we've got the passives, which are going to increase our ability to heal and improve our healing strength. The first passive is going to give us Major Mending, which gives us 16% increased healing after a heavy attack. You also heal yourself or an ally near the target for 15% of the damage inflicted by the final hit of a fully charged heavy attack. Restoration Expert, which is going to increase the healing done on allies under 30% health. Cycle of Life, which is going to cause our fully charged heavy attacks to restore significantly more magicka, 30% more when this is max level. Absorb, which is going to restore magicka whenever you block a spell. And Restoration Master, which is going to increase healing done with Restoration Staff abilities. The Restoration Staff is very straightforward. You typically see this on healers and sometimes in PvP builds and sometimes in off-meta tank builds that are built for maybe running dungeons without a healer in the group. But for the most part, these are dedicated to healers. All right, so a quick recap. You've got the two-handed weapons, which are great for stamina DPS. They're okay for magicka DPS now with some of the recent changes. Once again, if you heavy attack with these, you're going to get stamina back and not magicka. And you're going to be restricting your magicka tune to being within melee range so that you can do your light attacks, which are very important to proccing your enchants on your weapon and also starting that ultimate regeneration. Your one-hand and shield line, which is essential for tanks in endgame content and incredibly useful for tanks in all of the rest of the content. And it can also be very useful for PvP builds when you need a bar to turtle on in case of incoming damage. Dual wield, which is fantastic for stamina DPS, especially in PvE. It's worth noting that dual wield and two-hand are very well balanced in Elder Scrolls Online. You should not feel like you have to go one or the other in PvE content. They both put out almost identical damage. It's really about picking the aesthetic and the playstyle that looks more fun to you and going with that. You don't have to do one or the other. I will say that running a brawler build with a two-handed weapon is incredibly satisfying and safe and easy to learn. So if you find yourself feeling very papery and dying a lot with a dual wield setup, consider trying the two-hander and a brawler setup and seeing how that feels, especially for solo content. This does wonders to make your melee tune feel like an absolute beast. Next, we have the bow, which is very much a stamina DPS weapon line. It's great for dealing out damage at range, just like you would expect. No real surprises here. In group composition, you typically stand quite close to enemies anyway, so you don't get to be very far and take advantage of standing very far from your enemies very often. But in PvP, it can be very effective for taking down enemies at range. Next, we have the Destruction Staff, which is a fantastic skill line for tanks, damage dealers, and healers. All three roles use this weapon line very frequently. The tanks are using the Frost Staff on the back bar. The damage dealers are using any one of the three staves very frequently. Primarily the Fire Staff for the single target damage, the Lightning Staff if they want to have some kind of heavy attack lightning AoE damage build, and the Frost Staff is fantastic for both the healers and the tanks, and for the Magdans. Then last but not least, you've got the Restoration Staff, which is specifically for healers, but you can see it in some PvP builds and sometimes on off-meta tank builds. So let me know down in the comments below, which weapon line is your favorite? Which one looks the most appealing to you? I'd like to thank my YouTube members for supporting the channel by becoming members. To find out how to become a member of this channel and what the perks are, click the join button below. And I'd also like to throw a special thank you to my editor Desh for doing a fantastic job on all of these videos lately. If you've noticed an increase in quality, that's all her. And if you ever want to hang out with someone else who loves ESO, be sure to swing by my Twitch channel over at twitch.tv/luckyghost. I'll see you guys in the next video.